Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to be talking today about the earliest forms of governance, particularly democracy and socialism and authoritarianism and the monetary system, capitalism. Socialism is a bit of both. Historical timeline, democracy, capitalism, socialism, and authoritarianism. Today, we're going to go over this document and add a very tiny little bit of extra meat, knowing that we are going to then make a couple of other videos that are going to get more into the complexities, shall we say. What was going on when these things were getting started? We had certain types of authoritarianism, tribes, we had clans, and they were basically strong people, mostly men, who took over an entire area, said it was theirs, and probably started charging people money to live there. We had a lot of that. A lot of life was what Hobbes would say was what was it? Short, nasty, and brutish.
Correct.
And that government was here to alleviate that a bit for people. That would be the point of a good governance. So in ancient times, both ancient Greece and ancient China, there were some very different governing constructs being developed. Democracy in ancient Greece started with Solon, who took away debt slavery, meaning that if you owed money, you could become a slave to your debtor, and developed some democratic elements. Then Cleisthenes created the world's first democratic system in Athens and started having citizen assemblies. Pericles followed that up with what became the golden age of Athenian democracy. And in the end, Athens was able to develop a form of direct democracy for the male citizens. Women, slaves, and foreigners, and also certain felons were excluded. So you ended up with about 10% of people who were making the decisions, and that was about as direct as they could be.
Right.
And even at that point, there was a panel, a small committee that decided on what issues they were going to discuss and vote on. But that's how our democracy, the concepts of democracy got started. And in the next video, we will be focused on talking about those three people and those three times, Solon, Cleisthenes, and Pericles, the people who surrounded them and what they did in a little bit more depth. Rhonda.
I'll be covering authoritarianism. The roots of authoritarianism developed in ancient China around 551 BCE. Confucius, he codified rules and laws and the interrelations between people, and sort of made the emperor the highest authority. Next, during the Warring States period that followed, this is where the various Chinese states became very powerful, each one, and they were vying for power and who could consolidate and control what later became China.
Kind of like what eventually happened in Europe over and over.
Yes. And so we had legalism beginning to develop to constrain the relations between these states.
And then that makes me think of federalism, which would control things about how states interact.
Right.
Interesting.
And then these, as I was saying earlier, Confucianism and the legalism mandated that the power be in the emperor, in the state, the mandate of heaven.
Interesting. I'm sorry.
So, not only the codified laws and written pieces of men weren't actually quite good enough. They needed the authority of a, kind of a heaven to bestow the power. So it was kind of, to me, it seems like it was a combination. They needed both those things to give the human person.
It makes sense in a way, because you think about in the that we consider these truths to be self-evident and how the rights are endowed by the Creator.
That's right.
So I do think that people have trouble getting other people to listen to their ideas and their rules and their constraints and whatever, so they bring in God.
Right.
All right, well, now we're going to go back to democracy in Greece and bring in Rome. So the best time, the golden years that Pericles heralded and sustained. I did talk about Pericles a bit. Okay, just that little bit. Came between a couple of wars. And the Peloponnesian War came towards the end. So during Pericles' time, where it was the golden time of Athens, is when we had the drama come out, and the art and philosophy. People had, I guess, a nice life and some leisure time, and so all these arts came out. And then there was the Peloponnesian War, which weakened Athenian democracy. Then there was the whole trial of Socrates. There's some argument about how real Socrates is, and was he an invention of Plato, or was he a real person? But therefore Plato and the Republic, and talking about what are the limits of democracy. And Plato was very concerned about mob rule. And Aristotle comes in, and Aristotle, they were worried about the tyranny of the majority and mob rule. So they're worried that common people band together and there's more of them than there is of the aristocracy, which is why power seems to keep trickling up. Power can be given to people, they can have a revolution and take it, and then it goes to the people who represent those people, and then it seems to go to whoever can consolidate a certain amount of power till ultimately you seem to have some person or a few people. But we'll talk about that later too. Aristotle comes along and analyzes democracy and says that democracy is only one of 6 different types. We'll talk about that later on as well, and the cycles that he saw. You can have a rule by one person or a few people or lots of people or everybody. And what are they ruling for? Who are they ruling for? And he's able to define it into 6 things. And of course, as soon as you have 6 things, you can have hybrids and something that's off the chart. And so it's interesting because we came up with a theory. Aristotle has a theory, and we did a little study on how they were similar and how they were different. And it's quite interesting. That will come up too. So capitalism. Well, the earliest foundations of capitalism come in ancient times in very normal things. I'll give my little shoemaker analogy. So people at some point started having agriculture, and so they weren't depending on the movements of the animals and the seasons completely, although agriculture depends on those things as well, but it's different. They have to stay in one place. If you're going to have a lot of agriculture, you have to tend it, and you have to be there to harvest and all of that. So people start settling down. They start living in little clusters. Imagine then that somebody who raises cows, and they might sell the meat or whatever. They also have stuff they make into leather, skin they make into leather, hide they make into leather, and they start making shoes. And maybe several people make shoes. Everybody makes shoes for their family, but this one particular person makes shoes better than everyone else, and starts having people saying, hey, make me a pair, hey, make me a pair. At some point, there's more work than this person can do. Now, we've already mentioned stuff about trade. We have people who might give shells or whatever for the pair of shoes. So we have some of that. And that basic trade is not capitalism, but capitalism banks on that. Literally. So it's only funny because it was an accident. So the shoemaker has more work than he or his family, their family, her, shoemakers. And you get that idea of where names come from. In any case, they have more work than they can handle. So what they do is they hire the kid next door who perhaps, for whatever reason, they're not getting enough food. They're not able to make it. So the kid from next door comes over, helps make shoes, and gets a percentage of the money that comes in, or gets paid per shoe, or gets food for, I don't know. But something like that is at the very, very beginning of this idea that this kid has labor, this guy has capital, and the two can come together. Now, I thought that that's what capitalism kind of was. In any case, capitalism. So there was the ancient trade, starting with Phoenician merchants who developed these early market systems. So as soon as it starts being a system, as soon as the trade starts going beyond the neighbors trading with one another, as soon as you start having trade routes, As soon as you start having money that more than one culture would recognize separate from each individual culture, you start having that very beginning of market systems. And in Rome, they started having property rights and contract law, and banking systems come out. Again, not just a bank, but systems of banking that people could agree upon. Because once you have banks, you have a way of a commercial institution lending money and making money on the money. People put their money there for safekeeping. They use that money. They lend it out. They get back that money plus some. They get a profit. The other person who gave them their money for safekeeping gets a profit. Everyone's happy.
Right?
To a point.
To a point.
To a point. So the concept here is, in ancient Rome, in the Phoenicians, in ancient Greece, there was plenty of private trade, but there wasn't an economic system until towards the end. They started agreeing on things and making systems whereupon people with money could use that money to both buy labor and some types of investments and things, so that the money itself began to make money. And that is the beginning of capitalism.
And authoritarianism continued during this ancient time. In China, absolute imperial rule was developed around 221 BCE. More legalist policies and a centralized bureaucracy became the norm. Books were burned that didn't comport with the official centralized view established.
They keep doing it.
Right? And then the Han Dynasty unites China around 206 BCE, and that blends the Confucianism that was developed earlier with their imperial authority.
Wow.
So they could maintain their own power. Now, authoritarianism also developed, had a big development in the Western Hemisphere in Rome. It came later than the beginnings of authoritarianism in China.
Interesting.
A few hundred years later.
Well, because Rome had that republic, and they had a senate, and they had all this good stuff going on, and then Julius Caesar, I guess, decided to seize enough power to upset people, right?
That's right.
So they kill him.
Exactly. He became dictator.
Right, and then you get Augustus. Now, if I remember correctly, Augustus was the first emperor.
That's right. He was the first emperor. So, yeah, he ended the Republic period. And then the cult of personality, the imperial cult, developed. So a cult around the emperor became very important in the control of the people.
You mean whoever was the emperor,
Whoever was,
North Korea, blah, blah.
Right. Nero, or, cult
yeah.
of the emperor. And then the authoritarianism was formalized by Diocletian in 284 CE. He formalized the structure.
Formalized an
formalized an autocratic structure.
Huh. Okay. Well, then the Roman Republic traditions kept persisting in theory, but not practice. Why does that remind me of Hungary?
Right.
Democracy was still there, but it was sort of a sterile democracy because it was being controlled by the emperor, but they allowed people, I guess, to meet and vote and talk. There were some limited democratic elements also in Roman provincial governance. Again, I have to come back to federalism. The idea that, why do I keep coming back to today? The idea that they wanted there to be this one central governance with the emperor being in control of everything. But if you guys all want to have little democracies for your little areas, you can do what you'd like.
That's right.
All right, so we move into the medieval period, where from 500 to 1000 Common Era, there's feudalism and religious authority. So, whereas before it was more tribal, Now we have official feudalism, like with lords and monasteries and priests and people, all kinds of authorities telling you what to do based on what God-given rights they had, not you.
During this period, authoritarianism took a form in feudalism, where the king would consolidate power and he would hand out fiefdoms to underlords, to knights, so they would have a piece of their own land to manage, but would still be beholden to the king. And they would have to give him a piece of whatever they earned. And they would have to go fight wars for him. So, and these kings were generally said they were given their power by divinity, divine right. So whatever god they chose was the one that gave them the authority in those days.
How convenient.
Yeah, right. And then Charlemagne rose to power, and he, once the Roman Empire fell, later he became the Holy Roman Empire, which really, Rome was already dead by now. So the reason, I think they just co-opted the name because it gave them the sense of the Roman authority and power.
Well, sure, it's why they brought back Confucius. I think it's a similar kind of a thing.
Right. So there was theocratic authoritarianism. As I said, the Roman Empire collapsed and it became, there were two different empires. There was the western part and the eastern part. And the eastern part was called the Byzantine Empire. And so it tried to continue the Roman part as long as they could, but then they fell once the Muslims, took them out. The Western Roman Empire were kicked by the Vandals, and Rome was sacked, and so the Western Empire fell way before the Byzantine Empire.
Well, and it broke into all these little parts that couldn't keep up the urbanism and just...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And then we have these proto-forms of capitalism because, well, here's kind of what I'm thinking. You have all this structure from Rome, right? All this structure that they set up. But you're falling back into kind of clans and tribes and kingdoms, and it's a form of all of that, where each little group has kind of their own set of rules and things. So these things it looks to me like things combine and split apart and recombine in different ways.
Right.
So you end up with these medieval trade guilds, where the guild themselves controls the production and prices. And in Italy, in general, I guess now is it Italy yet? I'm not even sure. Venice and Genoa, maritime republic, so they have merchant capitalism, so you start getting trade across the seas. And there were limited markets. The church has a lot of power, remember, in Rome and in Italy. And there are restrictions on usury that inhibit capital accumulation. So they're trying to put a check on those early forms of capitalism, saying, wait a minute now. Just because you have all the money does not mean that you can exploit these people to that extent.
Right.
So then, at this time, there are still some very limited forms of democracy in some places. Looks like in Iceland. In Switzerland, they had small towns or cantons that did use local assemblies.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. And then, who wrote the Magna Carta? Do we know? It was written in 1215.
Well, I don't know who wrote it for sure.
Well, it limits monarchical power.
Right.
It actually...
No,
Yes.
go ahead. All I know is that they made an English king sign it. But I don't remember which English king. So.
All right. So when we go back to this, that's what we can talk about a little bit.
Yeah.
We can talk about what it says, because it limits that power, and then it establishes the rule of law principle. So here we know that some things literally did come from ancient Rome, and other things came from ancient English principles, like common law kinds of things. I believe the rule-based things came from Rome, and the more this is how people believe and live came more from England, and then they came together right about here.
Right.
And then we have those two things you can see in our Constitution and our laws. So then we move into the later medieval times, and now we start having the emergence of actual capitalism. All right. So the emergence of actual capitalism came really in the 1200s, where the Italian city-states developed banking, the Medici family, right? Medici?
Correct.
And you started finding these very successful families. You found, and I don't know when they came about, we'll probably talk about them later anyway, the Rothschilds and different families that got into the business of using the money they were able to acquire to make more money. And that's what they did to become wealthy. And of course, investing in trade. I think trade, insurance, and capitalism is how rich people really made their money at this point. So there was the Hanseatic League, the Northern European Trade Confederation, and somebody invented double entry bookkeeping in the 1300s. Now, I don't know for sure what double entry bookkeeping is and what that had to do with developing capitalism, but as we get into talking about that in further videos, I want to find that out, because I knew that was an important thing for bookkeepers to know how to do, but I don't know why. And then they talk about the enclosure movement in England. And Rhonda said that she thought it was putting up fences.
Right. They used to have the commons.
Right. And so people started, well, first of all, some people started overusing commons, and then other people said, oh, we'll take care of it. And then they're taking care of it and stewarding it became they owned it and put fences around it and limited the common area probably to wealthier people and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, this is very limited growth of democracy at this time. Remember, this wasn't a spectacularly enlightened period. Most people were living in poverty and misery quite a bit. And the people that were comfortable weren't wanting to rock the boat, if that doesn't sound familiar. So in 1265, the English Parliament was established. We should find out what Simon de Montfort had to do with it, because he doesn't sound British, so I'm just kind of curious.
Right.
Or I just made an accent and made his name, I don't know. In 1295, there was a model parliament, which included the commoners, because I guess at first it was just the House of Lords, and now there was the House of Lords and House of Commoners. House of Commons. No? Commoners?
Yes,
Commons. Okay. And then there are city-states like Florence and Venice that were maintaining oligarchic republics. Being that that's a step closer, I guess, to a democracy than a monarchy is? I'm not sure.
Very tiny step, I
think. I know Aristotle would be like, but it could be a step. I don't recall which direction his theory went. Well,
no, and I suppose depending on their intention.
Right. But the way Aristotle separated it, there was the oligarchy and the aristocracy, and they were different. And I think the oligarchy was naughty, but I don't remember for sure. All right, let's move on. The early modern period. Well, there's the Renaissance and the Reformation. And there was a whole commercial revolution. This is where Marco Polo had done his thing. He had connected things, I think, a lot. Marco Polo and other adventurers connected up, for example, China and India with the West, right? And so you now had trade routes, and you had a lot of money to be made, and markets opening up and all this. Columbus opens up the Atlantic trade, which was really the purpose of Columbus's voyage, was to open up trade. It really wasn't to find new land or exploit people that way.
No, it was to find the alternate route to India.
Right. In the 1500s, there was American silver coming in that, I didn't know this, that led to a price revolution. Because that was before Comstock and all that in Nevada.
Yeah, when they're saying American silver, I'm curious. That might be South American silver.
That's what I was just thinking, Argentina and stuff like that, possibly.
Right, the Spanish Empire.
Because they kind of raped them first.
Exactly.
Right? Exactly. And then the Dutch East India Company and other things like that started coming up where they had joint stock. That's the first I'm hearing of the idea of stock, where people would buy stock. Now I'm guessing, tell me if I'm wrong, I'm guessing this means that people said, hey, I want part of whatever you're going to get, so I'm going to give you some money to go do something. When you come back and you sell everything, I have invested in what you're getting. Yeah?
Yeah.
And I know that at that same time, people were starting to develop insurance on these things, so that if they went and took everybody's money and lost it at sea, or were robbed, or pirates, or whatever the deal was, that the insurance company would make sure the investors didn't get effed over.
That's right.
Right? And so then there was mercantilism as an economic policy. What, I'm not sure the definition for sure of mercantilism in that case. Merchants?
I think so, yeah.
The middleman.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So the middleman. Well, that makes sense, because the insurer and the investor and things, and then you'd have the person that did the actual travel, and you'd have the person who maybe made the phone calls to make sure that the travel was going to be successful. Well, there wouldn't have been phone calls, but you know what I mean.
No.
Okay, so here's the paradigm shift, and this is crucial. Before all of this happened, the basis of wealth was your land. If you didn't have land, you didn't have anything. You weren't even a citizen necessarily. Land. Then tied to that very, very, very closely would be your animals, would be your family, and how big your family was and their labor. All of those things are part of a land-based economic system. Then, as people were being the one to make the shoes and the one to make the clothes and trading with each other, and then having the best stuff in the village that you're trading to the big cities and selling for the big cities, and then the merchants, the middlemen in the big cities are now taking these things and putting them on ships, and then they're taking them to other parts of the world, and blah, 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 blah. I knew what I was saying. Oh, it started to become a trade-based wealth. That's crucially important understanding capitalism, because later on it becomes a capital-based wealth. Later on, beyond that, it becomes, well, we're into now where it's made up almost imaginary-based wealth. Wait, you'll see.
That's right.
The gold system goes to the paper system. Everything becomes more and more and more abstract.
That's right.
That's a piece of globalism, so hang on to those thoughts for later.
Right.
Right.
And during this time of the Renaissance, authoritarianism, we see the rise of Machiavelli's thoughts in Italy. And so he believes that the rulers can do whatever they really need to do to maintain their rule. And so...
some lines of thought never go away.
Exactly. So, also known as realpolitik. So he wrote The Prince in 1522 to kind of put his beliefs in writing, and maybe provide a manual for those who would come later in political career.
Two things when we come back to this. One, how much is this line of thought affecting what's going on today?
Right.
Along with the next one. Those two things are key.
Mm-hmm.
And when, what's his name? I wish I could remember his name. I can sort of see it. Wrote The Little Prince.
Oh, yeah.
That's so very opposite.
Right.
I would like to do a compare and contrast of those two pieces of work.
Interesting.
And see what values and what not values they both have, and see if there's any interesting connection.
Yeah, that's very.
All right, so go ahead with Henry VIII, and then I want to say something.
So then, in authoritarianism, we can move to England, where Henry VIII, who after many wives and clashes with the Catholic Church, decided that he would establish his own church, and that would give him the absolute authority to do what he needed to do, like divorce his wife, chop people's heads off, whatever he needed to do. He was the guy in charge now, because his God was telling him he was.
That's so funny.
And then on the continent, in France, we have Louis XIV, who said famously, "I am the state." So he was the source of everything in France. And so he was the absolute everything.
Nixon much?
Yeah, right.
So you can see from these guys that megalomania has always been here, will always be here, and these people seek power.
That's right.
There you are.
That's right.
I think that these things are super, super, super important because Machiavelli is saying, do whatever you need to do to succeed. And Henry VIII is saying, look, if God isn't on my side, I'll invent my own damn God.
That's right.
And then with Louis XIV saying, I am the state. What more justification does anybody with megalomania have to just declare themselves the power and move on?
Right.
It's never going to not be there.
That's right.
All right, well then in democracy, there's some theoretical development. There is the Protestant Reformation, and I think going back for a second to Henry VIII, when he was able to establish a new church and have everybody start believing, that opened the door for any figure that wants to use religion to say, well, all those are wrong, try mine. Again, that's something that's probably always been there and probably always will be there. But instead of the Vatican having the dominance over all non-Jewish and non-heathen thought, you now have this splintering. And it probably took away a lot of the power from the Vatican.
That's right.
So there's the Protestant Reformation, and I think they're talking about what? Luther. I don't know about Calvin yet. I think he came much later.
Mm-hmm. I think you're
Luther, blah, blah, blah. There was somebody else really big I can't think of. Oh well. We may or may not get into that. I'm not expecting us to delve too far into the specific theologic differences at this point.
right. Okay.
Although finding a thread of the kind of fervor, where does the populism go, could be interesting at some point.
Right.
In 1581, the Dutch Republic was established. And I see. Excuse me. The Protestant Reformation was interesting because it allowed for more indirect democratic implications, whereas the Catholic Church and probably the Anglican Church offered none. And the Dutch Republic established a partial representative government. So you're seeing these things with the parliaments and the representations and the little bits and pieces that people aren't standing for just simply being told what to do anymore. My guess is that just like us with the internet, just like back in the days of the radio, back here, all of the trade opens up ideas because you start seeing how other people do things. So I'm guessing that's why you have these periods of explosions. Then by 1600, we've moved into the Age of Enlightenment, and there's a philosophical revolution. Hobbes, good old Hobbes, who I've talked about a little bit. Hobbes talked about that governments are here because otherwise life sucks and people are rude and the strongest people come and beat everyone up and take over, so you have to have a government to prevent it. John Locke came along and talked about natural rights, think a Declaration of Independence, and that you have to have the consent of the people who are governed. And a lot of the beginnings of, well, he was in 1690 writing the two treatises of government, so his thinking very much would have influenced Jefferson. It did. Then we have Montesquieu, correct? Montesquieu in 1748, who wrote The Spirit of Laws, who talked about separation of powers. So I guess we've now seen by 1748 a lot of tyranny around the world that we've had a chance to talk about and look at from the perspective of history, with writing and with theories in place to complain and to figure out what to do. I think that the history of government, in my mind, seems to be a long, long history of people trying to put things in place to stop the tyrants from taking over and taking over and taking over and exploiting people. And they keep finding ways to do it anyway.
That sounds very similar to Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto. They say that the workers adapt to the new means of production, but as the workers try and get more control, The means of production will change.
Right? Which is also going back just all the way to Aristotle, where one form of government leads into another, which makes me wonder if we're ever going to have stasis. I don't know.
I don't know.
Rousseau came along and talked about a social contract. And you can see all of these things coming into our Constitution. You can see all of these things in the arguments of our founders. And using these different arguments to the Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison all argued with each other, and Burr, in order to come to some kinds of agreements to try and answer some of these concerns. Now, moving from there, at the same time in capitalism, in the 1600s, there was the Atlantic triangular trade, and you started seeing plantation slavery. So, unfortunately, we're talking about capitalism exploiting. Well, capitalism works on labor. Capitalism works on cheap labor. Capitalism found free labor. At least they thought it was free. It's not free. Nothing like that is free. More enclosure acts, more privatization of the common lands in England. At the same time, well, that hadn't happened yet, but at some point, I think it's a couple hundred years later, where you have the invention of barbed wire, and there was a whole lot of enclosure here.
Correct.
Banking systems, they established the Bank of England. Adam Smith comes along. Adam Smith was the explainer of capitalism in similar ways to how Marx and Engels were trying to explain socialism. He saw what was going on. He sort of saw some writing on the wall and tried to explain it so that people could see and maybe work on it. Because I think he was very much into the capitalism and what was going to happen, similar to Marx and Engels with socialism.
Mm-hmm.
And he talked about free markets at that point, and the invisible hand guiding everything, the supply and demand that would just make everything work the way it was supposed to. And of course, nobody ever tries to sully supply and demand or influence it improperly, right?
Yeah, right.
So mercantilism itself became challenged by the free trade theories. In other words, as soon as one thing happened where certain people were being rich, other people came along, looked at that and said, hey, I can mess with that and do this and do that and get rich my way. And sometimes the old systems weakened. So I think this is a good stopping place.
Yes, I think so too.